Welcome to the ClassicalU podcast. ClassicalU is a training platform with over 100 self-paced online courses and new content added regularly. We customize and brand learning pathways, serving schools as well as offering individual subscriptions to parents, teachers, and school leaders. Visit ClassicalU.com to learn more. I'm the director, Jesse Hake. On this show, I interview our course presenters as well as authors and leaders in classical education, talking about running a great classroom, teaching the human and fine arts, the great books. We're delighted to have you listening. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Parham, it's wonderful to have you back. I will probably refer to you as Angel, as
Absolutely.
We've been working together, and it's delightful to have you as a friend, as well as a distinguished author, presenter on ClassicalU. I'm excited to chat about a topic broadly related to your presenter in two different courses, the Black Intellectual Tradition and our course, Women in the Tradition.
Yes.
And thank you. Glad to have you in town.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here, Jesse. Thank you for this conversation.
So, a broad theme we were toying around with as we reflected on things we could chat about together was, what does it mean to have an American classical education? And the Greeks and Romans educated their children with, the Romans, as they picked up, wrote the Aeneid. Because they weren't, Homer was central to Greek formation and, piety, and but the Romans wanted their own kind of distinctive. So this is from the very beginning. It's not, I don't think, sort of antithetical to classical to say American classical.
Sure.
And I think this overlaps a lot with the great work you've been offering and contributing, the reflection in some of the courses, your book, of course. But how do you respond to that just very basic initial question of, should we think of American classical as a distinctive responsibility?
I think we have to. I'm not sure how you would educate otherwise, right? From every Italian I've ever spoken to, Dante holds a very different place in an Italian education than in an American classical education. Of course, we also love Dante, but it's not going to be quite the same, as if we were delivering a classical education in Italy. So I think it's entirely appropriate to think in terms of an American classical education. And I guess one of my kind of on-ramps to thinking about that would be the work that I do recently is thinking a lot about, what is the American project, and it's even that phrasing of the idea, the American project, can be controversial to many people, right? But I think it's really important for us to kind of grapple with what is the American project, and the foundations that you get this, in the Declaration, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that really touches into the great conversation so directly, right? So life, liberty, life, what is, the meaning, the ultimate meaning of life, liberty, what is the essence of liberty or freedom, happiness, same thing, what do we mean by a happy or a flourishing life? These are not things that Jefferson just, picked off the side of the road, right?
They're dead center on the great conversation.
They are, and yet they're being reinterpreted radically in an American context. And so I think to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and so this is not Frederick Douglass, this is Senator Douglass, Stephen Douglass. And, what was very much at issue in part of that debate was, what was really meant by this declaration? are we really all created equal? And so Douglas argued, well, of course, Jefferson couldn't really have meant we were all created equal. And Lincoln says, well, actually, yeah, that is what he meant. So this gets to the essence of the American project again. So really, the way that from the founding, we're already drawing deeply on the classical tradition, but in a uniquely American way.
We're also audaciously trying to apply it in very bold ways that inevitably reshape it and redefine.
That's
so
right.
What are some of the ways in which your contributions on ClassicalU and our courses overlap with the American project? Some of the there are a lot, and very obvious. But how would you articulate that or draw that out?
Absolutely. Well, I would say that so many of the writers of the Black intellectual tradition are true believers in the American project, and really want those ideals to be lived out, and are frustrated and disappointed when they're not lived out. And so part of what that tradition has been is really interrogating, what do we mean by these ideals, and how do we better live them out? And so that's how I tend to think of it. When I think about the idea of freedom, for instance, right? You come to understand freedom differently from the perspective of the enslaved and the formerly enslaved than you do from having kind of abstract, definitional conversations about what freedom is. Yeah. And so what I think you get out of many of these writers, and it's not just their writings, it's their lives, it's really their lives. One of the pairings, I like to put text into conversation with each other. And one of the pairings that I find to be really fascinating is between John Locke and Olaudah Equiano. So Olaudah Equiano, there's actually some question as to where he was born. He says he was born in West Africa. There's some documents that suggest he was born in the U.S. So we're not entirely clear, but what we do know is that the way he writes about West Africa accords very much with what we know was the case. So he might have been consulting travel writings, whatever it might be. And we also know for sure that he was enslaved and that he was working on many on Navy vessels and on slaving vessels and on trade ships. So that's all very well documented. And the reason I pair them together is that what you see Locke spelling out in Second Treatise of Government are these questions about, essentially, what does it mean to be free? How do you guarantee individual and political freedoms, right? But Locke, at the same time, knew what was happening in the American colonies. He was a secretary to the Earl of Shaftesbury, who had interest in the Carolinas. And so we know that Locke was reading all the correspondence coming from the Americas about what was happening to Native Americans, what was happening with Africans. And at the same time, he's very zealously defending a certain idea of individual and political freedom. And so he lays down the principles, but maybe we don't see them lived out in quite the same way for everyone. But then Olaudah Equiano is fascinating because he is living out. He's kind of, I think, takes up the baton from Locke in his life as an African enslaved in the Americas and is asking these questions of what does it mean to be free? And where are the areas of hypocrisy in what the Americans are saying and what they're actually doing? And so I think we get a much more robust understanding of freedom when we put these authors into conversation with each other. So Locke is very much, Jefferson was drawing directly on Locke when he is writing the Declaration, right? And then we have someone like Olaudah Equiano and Phyllis Wheatley, who are both, wrestling against slavery, but Wheatley, who's American, so Equiano was not American, he was British, but he was also sailing in the Americas. But Wheatley is very American in the sense that she is standing up for the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And so bringing these writers from the Black intellectual tradition into this question of freedom, and how do we incarnate that idea of freedom in the American project, I think gives us a much more interesting and robust conversation than otherwise. And I've been surprised the extent to which many of these writers are not really read very widely. And Phyllis Wheatley was right around the corner from the Boston Massacre. She sustained a writing relationship with George Washington. She wrote a poem to him, a letter. He wrote back to her. She was very much in the fray.
Yeah.
Same thing with Benjamin Banneker. So Benjamin Banneker also had a relationship writing to Jefferson and saying, hey, you wrote these words about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and, the equality. I like to hold you to that. Do you really believe this? So that's how I see bringing them into conversation. And I think particularly now, as we're going into the 250th next year, it's particularly important for us to revisit those conversations. What is the essence of our freedoms? What are the guarantors of our freedoms? There are, right now, I think we've got an unusually polarized political environment.
Yeah.
And, when I started out by saying, even talking about the idea of the American project is enough to get some people annoyed. I think it's important to revisit these voices where you see people who were unquestionably oppressed, in a way that's quite extreme compared to anyone living now, but who are very much standing up for the American ideals.
Yeah, still championing
it.
Project.
And I think we still need to do the self-critique that they were doing, but also the embrace of those ideals at the same time.
Yeah, these shared ideals. When you speak specifically of freedom, it occurs to me that, you're bringing back into the picture, I think, more classical understandings of freedom. We tend to think of freedom exclusively, nowadays in terms of the capacity of the will to get what it wants.
That's right.
And there's a high scholastic debate. I think the technical terms, the intellectualist position and the voluntarist position, where the intellect is the nous, the mind's capacity to be free versus the will's capacity to be free. In the voluntarist case, we are all sort of voluntarists. I think we're fixated on,
that's right.
Can I get what I want? If I can, I'm free. If I can't, I'm not. Whereas the classical tradition is much more concerned with the intellect's capacity to be free.
That's right.
Which is available to everyone in the most profound ways. And, I think there would have been a common consensus among the founding fathers and even the other voices. You're saying we're very much a part of the conversation that you can't have freedom without this more classical understanding, which is our own capacity to want the right things in the first place, not just get what we want, but am I free to want the very best things? Right. And so I think, I when you bring these other voices in, it adds a kind of embodied reality and lived experience that requires you to dig deeper into what the tradition actually holds regarding the nature of freedom itself. And it challenges the project, but it also reinforces the project. It reaffirms it, gives it life, and gives it a future potentially.
That's right.
Yeah. What are some of the? So you've mentioned the pursuit of happiness. Of course, that's a profound term with a long history. What are some of the other sort of categories and the ways that you've seen other voices in the American tradition interacting and deepening the sort of claims that we make and this audacious project that we're on?
Yeah, so certainly the idea of justice has been another one. And here I'm thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And so when I teach that, I like to really draw out the extent to which he's in dialogue with Socrates. Socrates in the Apology, when he talks about being a gadfly, and then he's also drawing on Augustine and the idea of an unjust law being no law at all. And Aquinas, also draws on Augustine in the Summa, kind of fleshing that out even further. And so it's really helpful to see King, really walking in that tradition with this idea of justice. And it's helpful to kind of bring students through that, right? Because we're at a time where, even though we're in the classical renewal, I think it's still a fairly circumscribed group of people who are very excited about it. Where I sit in kind of mainstream academic circles, there is not that kind of classical renewal. There is still this kind of reflexive pushing back against the idea of a canon or of classics as being too elitist, too Eurocentric, and so on and so forth. And so what I think is so important about intellectuals like MLK is he is doing this, absolutely important work, pushing back against a very violent kind of racial segregation, but he's drawing on this very deep tradition to do it. And so he's getting at nuances of the idea of justice and freedom that I think it's harder to get at if you're just, very superficially rooted. Yeah. And so for me, I want this classical renewal for everyone at all levels. And I just think it's true that people, at least the people that I work with in the academy, are much more likely to be open to it when their entree is through some of these more diverse voices, where they see, Anna Julia Cooper and Martin Luther King Jr., are some of even Malcolm X is reading classic text when he's in prison, and it's really transforming his thinking. So it's just, if we think of it in terms of multiple entrees into the great tradition, right? For some people, reading only European authors in the great tradition will be enough to get them very excited. But I would still argue that they won't as fully explore these ideas of justice and freedom as they would if they had a wider reference point of many different kinds of authors.
Interacting with the
tradition.
And the ideas, yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think also by joining the classic and the canonical authors with more recent authors, then it's easier for young people of all backgrounds to see, this is how this person in the 18th century or the 19th century made this old tradition new. And it invites them to do the same thing in their lives now. Yeah.
That I think it's Maximus the Confessor, a saint, a great Christian saint who suffered, who said something along the lines, and I shouldn't quote things that I can't give a reference for, although I could look this up, but that, you haven't received the tradition until you've given it something. Until the receiving the tradition necessarily entails adding to it in a sense, so that's a part of receiving. And, that... that's a part of talking, I think, about, what does it mean to have an American classical education? It's always true in every place, in every time. I hear you saying there, classical schools where every student, in a very, more holistic sense, is receiving this in some meaningful way, is a kind of testimony, witness to academia and some of their unique, some of the assumptions they make and things they're pushing back against that are hurtful, and creating a kind of shallowness potentially as they just kind of have a knee-jerk, reaction to colonialism and things. Right. So there's this kind of opportunity, it seems to me, that classical education, the renewal, has to really kind of be a counterculture voice, even in sort of the halls of power in academic terms. Is that accurate? I'm sort of pulling this thread out.
I would say it is an opportunity, but I feel that it is an opportunity that has not been nearly taken advantage of.
Yeah.
I just don't see, so the way that I'm talking about, the way that Anika Prather talks about it, and there are a few places that I see doing this kind of more capacious approach. Yeah. But I can't say I feel that is the modal experience.
Yeah.
And I have parents come up to me all the time who say, "Well, yeah, I've been thinking about classical, but it just seems like such a narrow, kind of lens on the world, and there's like almost no diverse authors, and so I'm not sure. Like, we like the truth, goodness, and beauty, and we, it looks great, but yeah." So that is enough to tell me that if we really want this for everyone, that it's important to do it in a way that helps people to see how vibrant and capacious the tradition is.
Yeah.
How it really is going to be something that is going to speak, that you and your child will be able to grab hold of that tradition and make it speak to where you are, because these are texts and ideas that really still live. Yeah. And I think it's just hard. We can say that, well, yes, we know that Plato and Aristotle and Dante speak to, great human longings and needs, and they absolutely do. And I think everyone should read them. But I think it's also true that we see this in a different way when we see, for instance, one of the projects that has been really interesting to me is just think the play Antigone, for instance. There's a group called the Theater of War. They put on plays in hurting communities, and they did Antigone in Ferguson. And, after all of the unrest between the police and the community and the hurt, putting on Antigone in Ferguson was an opportunity for there were members of the police force that came together with teachers, with family members, to really kind of grieve, but also to think through together what was it that united them as humans. And so you see Antigone uniting this largely black community in the 21st century. Because there are universal human ideals there, and then now you see how it's incarnated in this particular community. There's a version of Antigone in Haitian Creole called Antigone, which is written from the perspective of those who were under brutal dictatorship, and kind of, again, literally bodies in the street, and how do you respond to brutal power in the 20th century? So I just think... Yeah. It's not that. I think sometimes there's this impression in classical circles, oh, well, you just want us to sprinkle diversity here and there. But no, actually, I want our students to see that these are live issues, that people who are really in life and death situations are finding these texts to be absolutely crucial to helping them think through what it means to be human and how do we live. Yeah. And so that's all I'm asking,
Yeah. It's not, trying to make it more palatable or be politically correct, to use, an outdated term, but it is so that we can live this together. That's right. And,
that's right.
Yeah. But you're concerned that there's a kind of missed opportunity ongoing, and you're
so I say that. Yeah, I say that just because. So partly, I think it's the way the media spins the classical movement, which is generally not favorable. But it's also the way I think the movement itself frames what it's doing, and actually carries out what it's doing. And, one of those has to give, right? I don't really see the media changing what it does anytime soon. And so I do think that classical educators need to tell a different story, but then they also need to live a different story. Yeah. Like, you can't just say something that you're not doing.
Yeah.
So, that's...
Yeah, so to go back to our phrase, an American classical education, probably one response to that, in the general public might be, you're, raising up the Founding Fathers as, this exclusive club of, white men who, in the Western tradition and all of its kind of, domineering tendencies or whatnot. But when I think of the phrase an American classical education, it's almost like an opposite picture that is conjured up for me, which is it must be alive and present and in a real place and with real people, and it must include all of our greatest stories,
right.
All of our greatest sufferings and tragedies and triumphs, and relate those as they are related, as the characters themselves, the writers and thinkers and actors themselves related them to the great tradition. But you have these two very different ways of even responding to something like you said, to the American project or American classical.
Well, even like what you were saying about, the founders are all these oppressive white men, right? So let's stop right there. Because what people often don't realize, and part of what really inspired me in terms of some of the texts that I put together in the Black intellectual tradition, was that when you start really digging into those writers, you start to see how complicated, how complicated it is. George Washington, on the one hand, at a certain point, he writes a letter to a friend saying, I mean to never own another slave by purchase. Like, I'm done with the whole thing needs to go. I need to figure out how to get out of this thing. Jefferson tried several times over the course of his career to build in the abolition of slavery legally. Toward the end of his life, he's writing a letter and he says, I always thought that the next generation would really get rid of slavery because of these principles of freedom, right? And you see he's inconsistent.
Yeah.
Both he and Washington are inconsistent, but you do see a through line of, this is not a great institution. Slavery needs to go. Now, when it goes, how fast it goes, are they or are they not consistent in their thinking, their writing, their action? Not always. But for me, what that says is it brings us back again to, like, how do we live out our ideals? We are not always consistent. How do we get more consistent, more honest? And so what I see in those founders is the beginning of wrestling with ideals that we feel that we have not fully lived out. And so I think it's a laziness to just kind of say, they were just, racist oppressors.
Right.
Full stop.
Yeah.
When you actually read the letters, the documents, the correspondence, you see real people who, yes, sometimes are hypocritical, but you also see sincerity in, I want to do this one thing, but then there's this other pressure that's keeping me from doing it. Sometimes it's lack of virtue, and sometimes it's how do I, in the case of George Washington, he actually legally couldn't free all of his slaves because some of them belonged to his wife's estate. And so there were also legal complexities. Yeah. Anyway, I say none of that as excuses, but only to say that I really do push back against blanket statements.
Yeah.
Where people haven't read deeply and haven't thought about it carefully. And that's what I think we need to do. So when we're doing an American classical education and thinking about the American project and ideals, that these were real people with real vices as well as virtues. And it also shines a light on ourselves. Where are we being hypocritical, not following through on what these ideals are?
Yeah, so either way of kind of, exonerating or upholding the Founding Fathers as this kind of special category of people that achieved some, particularly unique thing in history, or just writing them off and sort of canceling them or whatever. Either one is a laziness, you're saying, and
very lazy.
That we cut ourselves off from our own life, by either path. What are some successes you're seeing? Either in institutions, teachers. We can get small. I know you've been working on some curriculum resources, that uphold a possibility here. I'd love for you to share a little about that, but just where else have you seen successes as far as those who you might be able to say, that's American classical education happening?
Absolutely. So I've been, in addition to the work that I do at the university level, I also do K-12 curricular development, and we help different programs start up and use our curriculum. And one of our largest users is a homeschool group in Georgia, a very large homeschool group, largely African American. And they have taken to our upper school year one curriculum. So that upper school year one curriculum puts into conversation founding fathers, Black intellectual tradition, classic text. And they were so intrigued by it that they've worked with a professor to make a dual enrollment course for it. So using those texts and kind of building a writing course, that's a college level course.
Wow.
And it's been so exciting to see them do that because, they really see these ideas living and this dialogue and this conversation going that kind of fleshes out, this idea of the American project by looking at the classical roots and the Black intellectual tradition interfacing with that, and the founding American documents as a kind of part of that woven tapestry. So that has been really very fulfilling and exciting to see the way that they've done that. And we've got more to come.
That's exciting. Thank you. I want to circle back at something from the very beginning of the conversation. You made the point that we did change some of the definitions and the trajectories of some of the great classical ideals and principles. Freedom, liberty, justice. Freedom, liberty, and justice. We might have made them shallower or narrower or even warped them, in their kind of telos. What are some ways? I'm a big lover of Wendell Berry, and I think there's some voices like that make this case in some very compelling ways. And we do have a new course on ClassicalU on Wendell Berry that lays some of that out. But how would you identify some of the key ways in which we've slightly, narrowed or warped some of the concepts in the American project specifically? What are some of the pitfalls, ways we've redefined things?
Yeah. So I think we have come to this strange place where we're at odds with the idea, say, of patriotism. And so it's either a thing where people on the left will tend to kind of say patriotism is almost just, kind of a really concerning kind of nationalism that is not good, whereas those who would tend to be on the right, patriotism almost seems to take over everything. And we don't seem to have a way to really love the American project and love what it means to be American without it, becoming one of these extremes where either we're just saying we don't even like the country or it's like the greatest thing ever, and you can't say anything bad about it. So we seem to not be able to kind of have this more nuanced conversation.
A real relationship.
Right. And that's where I do think, that's why I always really push the importance of original and primary documents. There's just no substitute. You can't get it from a textbook. You can't get it from, I don't know, listening to YouTube videos or whatever. Like, you really need to go back to primary text and get deep into the minds of the people who were writing them and wrestling with the ideas, and just kind of take them on as conversation partners in order to really get at it. And I think when you do that, you stop having these kind of superficial, polarized positions, because that's not what reality was historically. You see people that are wrestling with tensions, with difficulties, with, you know, wanting to live virtuously and then finding that they're not. So I think that's part of what we need to do. And I don't know if it's just that so much is going on and the pace of life is so fast that we rely on shortcuts, you know, whether it's Cliff's Notes or AI summaries or, you know, letting the algorithms sort all of our news for us. But one way or another, we have allowed meaning to be made for us rather than grappling with original text and deriving our own understanding from them.
So getting back to reality by requiring ourselves to encounter it over and over again. And classical education should, you know, and provides many ways for that to happen as you that's what, you know, the great books and the classics are in a profound sense. But you're referring to an even
here's
broader.
The thing, though. Here's the thing. So it always comes down to who are those texts, or what are those texts? And the kind of conversation we've been having and the authors that I'm referencing and the debates and the complexities, I fear do not often find their way into the syllabus or into the lesson plans, right? And so I think our students in classical schools are reading great texts. They are reading founding documents, but, you know, are they reading them? Like, are they looking at Benjamin Banneker pushing Thomas Jefferson to really live out those ideals? Like, that's the kind of thing. David Walker, he was writing in 1829 and 1830, and he's also in dialogue with Jefferson, at least on the page, where he, after denouncing the practice of slavery, so he was born free, he was also African American, but he ends his appeal by quoting the Declaration of Independence and saying, have you read your own text? Like, that's literally what he says. Americans, have you read your own declaration? Like, do you understand what it actually says here? So what I'm not clear, I haven't been in every classical school. I haven't looked at every, you know, civics or American history, but from what I have seen, it is not my understanding that that is the typical way that students are invited into the conversation. And so, yes, primary documents are being read. Yes, great texts are being read. But this kind of very careful curation of a more complex conversation, Native Americans as well. Phyllis Wheatley has a really fascinating exchange with Samson Occam, who is a Native American minister. And Samson Occam has a fascinating story. It was his work speaking largely abroad in Britain that raised the money to found Dartmouth College. A fascinating and sad tale that I will let others find out about. You know, but he was trying to raise money for Native American church planting and ministry. So there are so many ways to have this more nuanced and complex conversation that I think our students would come out of it being considerably enriched.
Yeah.
Part of what some of the college students that I get who've come up through kind of a more traditional classical education, some of them say, you know, my friend, you know, she had this kind of great classical Christian education, and then she comes to the university and hears all the critiques and, you know, like feels like, they kind of lied to me, or, you know, they really, you know, whitewash this history, and what can I really believe anymore? And then they can become super cynical.
Yeah, there's a reaction.
Whereas I think if we present it in an age-appropriate way, you know, the more complex threads of the conversation, when they get to the university that is not pro-Christian, that is even not always pro-American, that they will be equipped to say, oh, yeah, you know, I've come across some of this, and, well, I think if you were to read this more carefully, you'd have a better, you know, completer picture. We would have equipped them to go out into a polarized, cynical world where patriotism is not embraced, and really be, you know, they'd have the tools to have that conversation.
Be true patriots.
Yeah, they would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think within, you know, I'm always a little hesitant to make any claims about, you know, kind of uniqueness of a tradition, like, but unique, you know, special capacities or qualities, you know, that I kind of set it apart from any other human. So now I'm really zooming the lens out, you know, let's say Chinese classical tradition or, you know, Mayan civilization.
Sure.
But if there's any such claim to be made, you know, with kind of Greco-Roman, you know, story, it would be that kind of self-critical dialectic or, you know, Socratic. Like there is deeply within it, and this sense that it's a conversation, it's a quest, and it's always self-critical, and that's sort of built into the fabric of it. And Christianity absolutely added to that. You know, I think Christianity reinforced and drew that out, I think, in the best, truest, you know, truest to Christianity itself instances. That was, and so I think that's become, that always has been in the tradition, just becomes stronger and stronger. But everything I'm hearing you say, you know, is a loss of that, where when we think of the tradition as this kind of static thing that we need to uphold and, you know, get back to, or, you know, kind of put on a pedestal. It's not a conversation that is a sort of relentless pursuit of.
So, I mean, okay, so the language of get back to or uphold, I don't actually think there's anything wrong with those on the face of them. I mean, we've come so far that we do actually have to get back to those classics. You know, like we're so far away from it. And I do think we need to uphold them, as some of these writings are better than others, right? That's why they're classics. That's why they're part of the canon. Yep. I think, so we do have to, there is this work of retrieval that's absolutely necessary. But what you don't want is, I think what you're getting at, you know, is a kind of unthinking worshiping of it, or it's going to solve all of our problems. You know, if we just do the classical education and read the old text, it's going to form these people who are just going to be full of virtue automatically. I think what we need is we do need to get back to the best of the tradition with the aim of making it alive. And I think, and that is what some of these more recent writers into the 19th and 20th century who have gotten a classical education, like, say, Toni Morrison, who I write about in the Black intellectual tradition, and Martin Luther King Jr., that's what they're doing. Like, it's not something that they just kind of stodgily studied classic texts and, you know, no. So what we need to retrieve is, yes, learning the tradition, but very critically learning what it means to have it as a living and active part of one's life, one's thinking, and applying it to today. So it needs to be alive. It's to me, it's, you could have it as, you could retrieve the tradition in a way that's like a wooden idol, and it's there and you worship it, or in a way that has the breath of life blown into it, and that you can now actively be in conversation with and learn from and become a friend of, these great books and authors. So I think that's the difference.
So there are instances like Toni Morrison, where it's profoundly present even today. Why is it so difficult to, connect things like that with larger communities, teachers, students? We have these meaningful threads, examples, but it seems like even with a few really, really powerful living cases, I think a couple of podcast episodes ago, I had a conversation with Christine Perrin on some, the epic tradition in, Gilead and home, and so you have these novelists and who are engaging. Not in, it's not even on the surface. Like I think a lot of their readers don't even realize the depth of the engagement. Like a Toni Morrison with the classical tradition. I'm asking a sort of pointless question, but
I'm sure there's a very good point to it.
Yeah, but another way to ask it is, where are we seeing that recognized, and how do we receive more of it? You gave one wonderful example of the homeschool community in Georgia. Have you encountered at the college level those who would appreciate an author like Toni Morrison and the connectedness with the tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're definitely here and there. It's not that there isn't anyone doing it. Obviously, that there are people who are still writing and who are probing these authors for today. But what I would say is it wouldn't necessarily be common that you'd walk into a college today and take a course like the one I get to teach at Templeton Honors College on the Black intellectual tradition and the classics, which Brian Williams has invited me to do for their Master of Arts in Teaching for Classical Education, right? Yep. So I can't really think of many colleges across the country where you'd ever be offered a course like that. It's pretty rare. Yeah. So it's not that it's not happening at all. And let's see, I'm thinking about Professor Hairston at Wake Forest Academy, who's written The Ebony Column, which is on the Black intellectual tradition and the classics, which is a fairly recent book. And there are many, like if you're looking at it, the African American tradition, the classics, is probably the most robust, and so there are some classicists who are doing that work. In fact, more and more classicists who are doing that kind of work. But then the field of classics has kind of gotten off into its own polarized thing, where I won't even go into all of that. Let's just say that there's another kind of polarized debate that's happening there around race in the classics that can get a bit sticky. But the kind of approach that we take in the ClassicalU courses, for instance, is so refreshing because it's not bogged down in, say, racial politics or that kind of thing, right? It's just it's a breath of fresh air. Like, we just want to learn from and sit at the feet of this tradition. Whereas what you're more likely to get in academic classics is intense racial and cultural politics around it. It's harder to kind of have this sense of really sitting at the feet of the tradition, enjoying it. Yes, having some critical eye to it here and there, but mostly just trying to learn at the feet of the tradition.
Yeah. I mean, just that phrase, sitting at the feet of the tradition, is would be problematic all by itself
right.
in most, So, I mean, back to your point that there is a retrieval needed, there is something lost to be gotten back to. And yet, American classical is an old, by our own standard. I mean, it's been going on for a long time, and is a real story, and with living, active characters. What would the study of someone like Marilyn Robinson or Toni Morrison be like in a college university context? Would there must be some classes that are engaging, but would they make these connections, or would it be a more...
That's a good question. I think some of them would. It's hard for me to imagine how you would read Toni Morrison without making the connections to the classical and even the biblical elements in her work. But the way the university is organized, I'm not sitting in those classes, so I just don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how the connections are being made, but in order to really teach her text, you would have to make the connections. So I would hope that they're being made somehow. But
Well, I'll wrap up. We're about at the end of our time, but I've been kind of wallowing in hopelessness a little bit in the last couple of attempts at questions. You're part of an institute that is one of the principles is dense networks, and I do think that's something in my own reading and thinking, just learning from James Davison Hunter and the institute that you're part of there. That is a source of hope.
It is very much.
So these kinds of conversations and networking. So I guess I'll just grasp at hope from another angle and ask you, what are some of the conversation. You mentioned a few folks, but some of the institutions and people, that you've found helpful and to be, encouraging partners in your own work.
Well, certainly the Institute. So the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. So yes, founded by my colleague James Davison Hunter. What he does is he brings scholars together across disciplines to ask big questions about the good life and the good society. And it has just been an inestimable pleasure to be part of that and to be with scholars who are actively asking these questions. It's a very special place. It would not be your typical university that would have that. Yeah. And so that's been really, really helpful. There's also at the University of Virginia a professor in the politics department named Gerard Alexander who has founded a place called the Blue Ridge Center. It's its own separate entity, but right there near the university campus, where they also read great books and they invite students in for seminars to ask big questions. So there, I've found at the University of Virginia some really wonderful conversation partners who really care about this and who are making spaces for faculty and for students to read great text and have these conversations and ask these questions. And then, of course, there are other colleges like Templeton Honors College, Wyoming Catholic in the Catholic tradition, University of Dallas, my friend Jessica Hooten-Wilson at Pepperdine. There are many other kind of more specially oriented colleges around the classics. But even amongst those that aren't, some of the state colleges or There are now increasingly the schools of civic thought that are kind of bringing back some of the readings of the classics and thinking about the American project. So I am seeing a flourishing, even at the university level, either some of the more classically oriented colleges or at places like UVA, where you've got kind of these collections of scholars who are doing these great things.
Well, that's encouraging. I'll make myself a liar and ask one more question. That's just a short follow-up on that. You've mentioned the Ebony Column. What are a couple of top titles, books that you would recommend from out of these academic circles where you're seeing some encouragement and some fellowship?
Yeah. There's a really wonderful book by David Withen called Co-Workers in the Kingdom of Culture, which is all about the classical influence on W.E.B. Du Bois. And so it really thinks of him as a philosopher, and you see the thread of Platonic thought through so much of his work, from the early work to the latest work. And Du Bois is one of those authors who, he lived for about 100 years. He changed greatly. He became a communist. He left the country. But it's interesting that throughout all of that, you see a lot of the classic and Platonic influences that keep coming back over and over again. And so that book, Co-Workers in the Kingdom of Culture, is a really, really interesting one that I think is worth a read. And it gives you a lens into the classical tradition through Du Bois, which I think is really, really valuable. So I think that's a good one. I have a colleague at UVA in politics, Lori Balfour, who has a book just called Toni Morrison. And she's looking at Toni Morrison as a political theorist. So how does her literary work give us an eye into political theory and kind of her conception of the good society and the good life? So there are some really exciting works out there.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Angel. This has been absolutely delightful, and appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You've been listening to the ClassicalU podcast. Thank you for tuning in and for following us with our courses, training teachers, parents, school leaders on ClassicalU.com. Our training platform is owned and operated by Classical Academic Press. As listeners, you can purchase any book from Classical Academic Press outside of our digital items, as well as any ClassicalU subscription at our special listener discount of 10% off. Just enter the code CU Podcast, all one word, at the point of purchase to receive this discount on any book or ClassicalU.com subscription. Finally, please also watch for live learning webinars in collaboration with Olaudah Academy, which offers live online courses for primary and secondary students. Thank you for listening.